our webinar on how to help homeless youth and foster care youth access their driver's license and state identifications under state law and take advantage of the fee waiver. My name is Brett Murfish. I'm the Director of Youth Justice with Texas Appleseed. And today we're going to have a webinar with a presentation by Mary Christine Reed, who is with the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid and also with the Texas Foster Youth Justice Project. Mary Christine has been an attorney with Rio Grande Legal Aid for 25 years and has a lot of experience helping young people get all kinds of documents and recently helping with making sure that they have access to these fee waivers that were passed last session. And through the Texas Foster Youth Justice Project, she provides legal advice, assistance, guidance, and representation for current and former foster youth throughout Texas. And that's all free for those young people. Help people with issues involving foster youth rights and barriers to a successful transition to independent living. And the project also provides legal assistance to youth who are experiencing homelessness and may not have the support of parents and caregivers. We worked, Trala, identified a need for this bill, and with other groups, Texas Appleseed worked to pass it last session to try and remove some of the barriers, one of them being the fee waiver, but as you'll find out, some other barriers around what do you do if you don't have a permanent address? And so the law was changed to make it so that young people could use, a shelter address or their school address or their DPS office. So I'm going to turn it over to the real expert on this, Mary Christine Reed, and there will be time at the end for questions. So go ahead and put your questions on the Facebook Live. Feel free to do that throughout the presentation, and we will make sure and leave time to cover them. So Mary Christine, I am turning it over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I'm excited to be participating with this audience. Our project works with many people who work at schools with youth, foster youth, and homeless and unaccompanied youth. And we are, I really appreciate the work you do. You've been very helpful in many of our cases with many of our clients. Again, my name is Mary Christine Reed. I'm an attorney at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, which is a legal aid organization that provides free legal services to low-income people. And while the Trala works in about 1/3 of Texas, the Texas Foster Youth Justice Project, which I am part of, is works statewide. And as our title says, foster youth, we work with current and former foster youth legal problems. We also assist people who are working with current and former foster youth. So we ultimately, if the youth or young adult needs actual legal representation, they have to apply with us and be their client, but we get phone calls and emails and questions from people who work with foster youth and homeless youth. So I've had many school people contact me. We have CASAs, foster parents, caseworkers at CPS, concerned adults who have a youth with issues. And so we're available to provide some initial guidance and try to point you in the right direction, or let you know that the youth really needs to contact us to seek our assistance. This is our information. We have a phone number that people can call to contact us. And then we have an email address, info@texasfosteryouth.org. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see my work email address, but I encourage you to use this email address because it reaches everyone at our project. We have several attorneys on our staff. And as you can see, we're in different parts of the state, but we work with youth. We do, when there's not a pandemic, travel around the state. But we're very effective at working on issues remotely. So we've developed good expertise in the 12 years of our project history on that. We have a web page with a lot of the resources, lots of resources, both for foster youth and homeless youth. Some of the materials we're going to discuss today are available there, but I encourage you to visit our webpage. If in the future you're trying to find us, if you just look for Foster Youth Justice, you should be able to find us. One of the things that we also do is we publish something that's called the Guide for Those Aging Out of Foster Care in Texas. This is something we publish every other year. We update it based on the new laws, new information we have. Our 7th edition is currently available. It's available electronically on our webpage. We also have hard copies that when there is not a pandemic going on, that we will ship out to anyone who requests them to share with youth. And we have had many people tell us that this is a really good resource for homeless, unaccompanied youth who are, struggling to be transitioned to independence without the support, of family. So things about, it has sections about getting your apartment, utilities, various public benefits, and it's written at a youth-friendly level. So I encourage you to check it out on our webpage. Here's kind of a list of some of the issues that we have worked on. It's pretty broad. And so I would encourage you, if you are working with the homeless or foster youth or young adult, if you're just not sure if it's something we do, just contact us and ask. We've covered the spectrum. One of these issues you'll see is identity documents. This is one of the most common issues we have, unfortunately. And before we get into the actual material of the meat of the presentation, I wanted to just let you know about what materials we have. They're going to be there's going to be a link to them on the Facebook Live, and they will be archived there, and they will also be archived in YouTube. And you will be getting a email if you register for this presentation that has a link to get to these materials. So you'll find this actual PowerPoint, and then a document that we created called How Homeless and Unaccompanied Youth Can Get Their Texas Birth Certificate, ID Card, and Texas Driver's License. We have it in English and Spanish, and forms, and some of the DPS documents that we're going to be discussing. And unfortunately, this is a sort of despite some things in the law that make it a little simpler, getting your identification documents is just not simple. And hopefully having access to these documents will help a youth get through that process and figure out what you need and minimize the amount of frustration in the visits to the various offices to make sure you have what you need. So the first question is, why do you need identification documents? And I actually get this from some youth before they realize, well, why they really need it. But you need identification documents to be hired for a job, to rent an apartment, to open a bank account, to get public benefits, if you're going to go on an airplane, if you encounter the police, to legally drive and not get all sorts of tickets for driving without a license. You may need it for financial aid, college enrollment. You need it to take the GED test. You need it to vote. I mean, the list goes on and on. And you need it to obtain other identification documents. It's a catch-22 situation. If you don't have a photo ID, you can't get your birth certificate, and you can't get your birth certificate without your ID. But basically, it's really impossible to function in our society without identification documents. And I have had, unfortunately, many clients who are lacking those documents and who are stuck for months and months while we go through this process, because it's not quick to help get those documents for them. And they are sleeping on friends' couches. They're frustrated. They can't get a job. Their life is on a standstill. And that's not where you need to be when you're 18, 19 years old. If you start the process when a youth is even pre-16, you can identify problems before they become huge barriers. A lot of times we'll hear from a client that they call for help with this because they've been hired for a job, and the employer is asking to see the documents that they need to fill out the I-9 form. And they are very upset when they find out that it's not going to be something that they might be able to get done in the next day or two. And I occasionally have used this, why I was able to get a job without my documents. But the problem is generally those types of jobs are not the types of jobs that pay particularly well. They tend to take advantage of the employees. They may not pay them overtime. They may not pay for them for some of their hours. And it's not the kind of long-term career jobs that we would hope our young people are aiming for and getting to support themselves. So one of the important things to keep in mind is that they have to have original certified copies, not photocopies. A lot of times I will be told, even by caseworkers in CPS cases, like, oh yeah, we have their birth certificate or social security card, but actually all they have is a photocopy. That is not going to work for documentation, particularly if they go to DPS or some other entity that needs official documentations. Sometimes it can be difficult to track down birth certificates. The youth is unclear about their where they were born. They may not know their mother's maternal name, and sometimes the information isn't consistent. And it's a time-consuming process, particularly now with the pandemic, to get documents through government agencies. The Social Security office has been closed since March, and I don't know when it's going to be opening. DPS offices are open, but there's a huge backlog. It's very hard to get appointments. So all of these things are reasons why you need to plan ahead and start working on this before it's critical that they have those documents. Another thing that we see a lot with youth in foster care and homeless youth who often may have spent time in foster care or perhaps should have been in foster care is that they have name issues. And I think that some of this just comes from the dysfunctional things that have happened in their families during their lifetime. For example, they were a parent, they didn't have their father's name listed on their birth certificate. The parents went to court and got a child support order, and the last name was changed to the father's last name, and this child started using it, and that was what was used to enroll them in school. But it turns out that the birth certificate, nobody ever paid the $45 to update the birth certificate and submit a certified copy of the court order to update the name on it, so that their documents don't match with the name. Or sometimes the birth certificate, there is not a name, so they're listed as infant with the last name of the mother or the father. If parents either didn't tell the people at the hospital the name, or there was some mix up in the paperwork and it never got completed. And then sometimes people have used variations of the name for whatever reason. And so there's different documents at different places, different records under different names. And so can be a significant barrier. And then sometimes they need a copy of the certified copy of the court order where their name was changed in that child support case, or if they were in foster care in the CPS case. And it can be very challenging sometimes to get those orders. And I think if you're facing an issue with that, that would be something I would definitely contact us sooner rather than later. It's a lot easier for attorneys to get those orders than just an individual. In 2019, there was a new law, which was bill number HB 123, which is a nice number. I can actually remember it. And it made it easier for foster youth and homeless youth to obtain their identification documents. We're going to focus today on the homeless youth. The foster youth provisions are similar, but there's some differences. But for purposes of this presentation, we'll just focus on the homeless youth, because you're more likely to be working with them, and CPS should be working with the foster youth on assisting them under this law. And it makes it easier for them to obtain their Texas birth certificate. For a minor, you normally cannot get your birth certificate on your own in Texas, but if you are a minor who is in foster care or qualifies as homeless, you do not have to have parent consent or assistance in doing so. There is also no fee for the birth certificate, which I believe will be about $22. And when you go to DPS to get your ID or license, there is not a fee for the actual ID or license, which is $16 or $32 if you're an adult getting a license. And there is also no additional proof of residency required, which is actually, I think, the biggest benefit of this, because the number of documents you need when you go to DPS is extensive, and particularly for a youth who is not in stable housing and is homeless or doubled up, they may not have those documents. And so this eliminates the two pieces of documents that often are the most difficult for my clients to gather. And the law does mention that the fees have to be covered by donations, and if there's not enough donations, then it's not, then they can't get it free. There has been a huge outpouring of donations, so we don't think there's ever going to be an issue with there not being adequate funds in that account to pay for those fees. So if you shouldn't worry about that. And one of the things, if you're working with someone who's trying to get their identification documents, is you make sure they have original certified documents. I always like to ask, I get told people have advice, I ask to get a copy of it so I can see what it looks like. And if you are working with somebody who is not, physically there with you, but you can have them just take a photo of it and send it to you. And I always encourage people to make a paper and electronic copies of front and back of for the record if you're working with the youth, and give them a copy, because if you lose the document, sometimes it's easier to replace them if you actually just can submit a photocopy electronically, or if you are trying to track down information, if you at least have a document that shows what information is on it, it makes it easier to figure out who you have, what entity you have to contact to get it. And then with youth, it's really important to talk to them about how to store documents in a secure place. The ID and license should be the only document that they're carrying around, and talk to them about how to carry that around. It should not just be thrown in the backpack. It needs to be in a wallet, or I see some youth have, the phone with a little card carrier bag, but someplace where it's secure and that they're in the habit of, they take it out, putting it right back in. And that if somebody is helping them store it for them, if they're in a shelter or someplace like that where they have it kept in a file cabinet or something, not the ID or license, but their birth certificate or social security card, they need to be able to have access when needed, when they go for a job, they get hired for a job or something like that. And they need to learn about how to, once they get back from getting hired from that job, is to return the documents to the safe place. And this is not a skill that just that my clients need. It was a skill my children needed. And I remember my son, after he lost his ID a couple times, his license a couple times, he said, I now know I now know what I need to do when I'm at that airport and I give them my ID. I need to make sure I put it back in my wallet as soon as they give it back to me. So it's something just sort of ongoing coaching, which may not be appreciated, but that's just, some important information to pass on, and it's not something people know. And so the other important thing for identification documents is they need somebody as they're going through this process to really help them in gathering the required documents, just figuring out what it is they need, and figuring out where they go to get stuff. And I assume that's going to be a role that many of you will be playing. And again, it's really appreciated. As I said, we work with youth around the state, and we often it's much simpler if we have a caring adult of some sort involved to help that youth or younger adult go through this process. It just makes it that much easier for everyone. And just something to keep in mind, if a youth is born in another country, and so if there's no US birth certificate showing they were born in a US state, you must assume that they are not a citizen unless they have some document that shows their certified documentation of citizenship. If they don't have that document, even if they think they are, they're going to have a really hard time getting a job or proving their status when needed. And so it's something that just you need to be aware of. And they need to sort out whether they really have some sort of legal status in the US and obtain documentation of that status. If they believe that they have some sort of status, that they're a citizen, or that they had lawful permanent resident status, we can possibly assist them with getting helping them order a new copy of that documentation. It's a very lengthy process. So again, it's something that needs to be started months ahead of time. And if they are undocumented, they need to be talking to an immigration specialist for possible forms of relief. Very quickly, this law doesn't cover Social Security cards, but Social Security cards are a critical document. And there's just some information about what somebody can use to get a copy of their Social Security card. The rules are a little bit different if they're between the ages of 6 and 17. As you can see, they can use a school ID card or a certified record, transcript, or report card. So that would be something that you all could help them with. And they can use that to identify themselves when they go to the Social Security office once they reopen from the pandemic. And there's a link in the there where you can find more information about the Social Security card, to what you need to replace your Social Security card. And there's additional information about what it is over 18. And they're also, even if you're working with a family who has younger children that needs them, there's different rules for children under 6. So you can look those up there. So who is covered by the new law? It's somebody who is a homeless child or youth. It's the meaning assigned by the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. I'm assuming because you're here, most of you are familiar with that definition. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes these youth won't necessarily think of themselves as homeless. Perhaps they have been living with a friend's family for a year, and that parent of their friend is kind of, providing that parent role. And the youth feel stable in their housing, and they still qualify as homeless, and that they would be covered by this law. So if they're sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, similar reasons, obviously shelters and things like that, they qualify. And so if you know a youth who's experiencing issues with getting identification, it's worth exploring whether they fit the criteria of somebody who could be considered a homeless child or youth. The law does not specifically say, the Texas law does not specifically say what age is covered, but it's I think that you could safely say if you're working with a student who's in school, that it's the ages 0 through 21, or possibly 22 for students who are in special education. The DPS rules, the birth certificate office don't specify an age. And so if you are working with a young adult who's in a shelter, or if it's in school, if they're even just in a shelter and they're not attending school, but they're younger than 21, I think you can provide the documentation that they're homeless, and they should be able to go obtain their ID card or their birth certificate. So for children and youth, there's no requirement that they be unaccompanied. I mean, that was the primary group that we were thinking of that has difficulties getting their ID because they don't have the parent to get their birth certificate, and there are other barriers. But the law doesn't specify that. So if you are working with families that need their birth certificates of their children for public benefits, school, housing, if those children are people that you can certify as homeless, their parents and caregivers can use that homeless certification that we're going to talk about in a minute to obtain their birth certificates. Generally, a young child probably doesn't need a Texas ID, but if you're getting into youth once they're in their teens, that might be a good idea for them to get that as well. Just real quickly, foster youth, it's going to cover youth who are currently in foster care. The youth can be once they're 18, they can stay in foster care. It's called extended foster care. But it does not cover youth who were formerly in foster care. However, those youth may qualify as homeless youth. So The way to document for a youth who's going to go to the birth certificate office or the DPS that they are homeless is to fill out a certification of homeless status form. This was a form that Brett and I developed after the law went into effect. We did get some input from the Texas Education Agency. Unfortunately, Texas Education Agency eventually said that they were not going to use our form and make it available at their homeless education office, and they were going to develop their own form, and they haven't seemed to have done any of that yet. But the law does not require any specific form or document, but we wanted to create something that would make it easy for people like you to fill out and certify a youth, and that was sort of a standardized form that would be easy for people at the birth certificate offices and DPS to recognize. And both DPS and Texas Vital Statistics have included it in their procedures and guidance. So that I was very excited about. So if you go to the Vital Statistics webpage that talks about this law, our form is there, and DPS has the form in their materials and their guidance for their staff and the procedures that they follow when homeless youth comes. And so I think it's very important that you try to use this form. Well, you don't necessarily have to. It's much more likely to be recognized. The document just has to certify that the youth is homeless as defined by the McKinney-Vento Assistance Act and has to be issued by one of these people: a school district in which the child or youth is enrolled, an emergency shelter or transitional housing program that's funded by HUD, the director of a basic runaway or homeless youth or transitional living program. So those are the people authorized under law to issue the certification. It's actually just for DPS. It doesn't specify what's needed for birth certificates, although I would encourage you to try, if you were involved in a school district, that you just try to follow that same criteria. And here is a picture of the form, which is in the materials. It's also on our webpage. It's very simple. You just have to, fill out the child or youth's name, your name, and the basic information listed there. And on the back of the form, we list the law and information about that. And that I think hopefully makes it easier when the youth shows up to the local birth certificate office or the DPS office, where they haven't, the person they encounter there has not worked with the youth before, that they will hopefully be able to see this, and the youth can point to it that, yes, this is a law, and they will at least try to figure out what that means, and that if they need to follow this law. So birth certificates, very important to keep in mind. This law that we're talking about only applies for people who've been born in Texas. If a youth was born in another state, they have to get their birth certificate from that other state, and Texas just can't tell the other states what to do. So each state will have their own rules about how to get a birth certificate and what is required. So if you're working with a youth who's from another state that needs a birth certificate, some things to keep in mind. Sometimes if they know exactly which local area they were born in, their local birth certificate office, sometimes you can get somebody on the phone and they're more flexible and quick. Not always, but sometimes that's a good way to try to figure out what's needed. And some other states, I know New Jersey, have provisions that allow for waiver of fees for homeless youth. And so that's something you could look into if you're looking for an out-of-state birth certificate. If a youth was adopted, in theory, what should happen after someone is adopted is that the court issues an adoption order, there's some paperwork filled out, and then the parents and the attorney who did the adoption send that information to the state birth certificate office where that child was born to update the records to change that birth certificate to the child's new name and new parents. Unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't happen, particularly for youth who are adopted out of foster care. The process sort of falls apart and then nobody ever does the paperwork, but that's what should happen. So, so you have to go back to that original state to get that birth certificate. And then one thing just to kind of be aware of, if you have a youth who was born in a foreign country, who was the parents usually went there to adopt the child, in a foreign country, they can come back, they can re-adopt the child in a Texas court, mainly for the purposes of getting a Texas birth certificate. And it will show that that child was actually, for example, I had a client who'd been born in Vietnam. And so it showed that he was born in Vietnam, but it was at least a birth certificate because he did not have the Vietnamese birth certificate. But it is not proof of US citizenship. So it won't necessarily work when they go to DPS if they have to show that they are a US citizen, but it is at least a birth certificate if they need that at the Social Security office or someplace. Again, no parental consent is required if they're under 18. They can get the fee waiver. But you can't order online to get the fee waiver. You either have to visit one of the local offices or order by mail. Ordering by mail is taking at least a couple months nowadays. It was taking a long time before the pandemic, and I think it's just getting longer. There's a website that I've listed there, which you can look up what local offices there are. So it varies. There's municipal birth certificates office, there's county clerks, there's a range of things. And some of them are able to provide a birth certificate for somebody who was born in another part of Texas. Some of them are not. I don't know why it's like that, but that's the way it is. And so you have to, when you go to that website, you need to follow the directions to make sure that the office you're going to go to is one that can provide the birth certificate for a youth that was born someplace else in Texas. And then again, if you're ordering it by mail, it can take a long time. So the local office can be quicker. Sometimes the local office doesn't understand the law, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And the Texas Vital Statistic has a website, a page on their website with information about this law. So that's a good place to look as well. You can find more information about obtaining a Texas birth certificate with our how homeless and unaccompanied youth can get their Texas birth certificate, ID card, and Texas driver's license. It just takes you through the process step by step. And so that's where I really encourage you to look as a starting point. If a youth, and first of all, I think it's just very, very helpful if somebody, a caring adult of some sort, go with the youth to these offices. It's often challenging for our youth to advocate for themselves, particularly when it's something complicated like this. And sometimes, there's not a familiarity locally with the law. So I've had a youth recently who did this on his own. He was able to do that advocacy, but he was prepared to, tell them to check the website, ask to speak to a supervisor, and then you can ask them to call the state vital statistics office. And then as a final thing, if they're still saying you don't qualify, is obtain the name of the person denying, the reason for the denial, and then contact our project. Now, I have to say, Vital Statistics has been very supportive of this law, the state office. They implemented it like within a month or two after the bill passed. As DPS, it took almost a year for it all to be finalized. And they have been, when we have had people report problems, there's somebody at the office I call, and they immediately follow up with that office, and then we have not had any more problems. So when I say contact us, I would encourage you, just you as a school personnel, you can just contact us and say, hey, we're having this problem with this office, and that can be our first point. We don't have to go through the process of signing up for you for the client. I can just contact Vital Statistics and say, could you please talk to this office? And if once they notify me that they seem to have cleared up the matter with the local office, that hopefully you can go back and confirm that it's working, and will work for that youth and a future youth. I'm not going to read through every single document that is required to be, what somebody is required to have to get their birth certificate. It's very fact specific. You need to sit down with the youth and go over what they have. But generally for a birth certificate, the youth is not going to have a primary acceptable document because they don't have a driver's license or ID yet. That's why they need their birth certificate to get those documents. So if for Vital Statistics, for proof to get a birth certificate, if you have 2 secondary acceptable IDs or 1 secondary and 2 supporting documents. And they have a long list of Vital Statistics in this PowerPoint, and in our materials, we've listed the ones that a youth is most likely to have. And so current school or work ID, Social Security card, Medicaid card, or health insurance card. If you are working with a youth, make sure they have their school ID, and that should be sufficient with the certification form that you've completed, along with some supporting documents. So official school records. As again, you can see the benefits of doing this while somebody's still in school, which is one of the good reasons to take care of it before they're 18. And medical records, paycheck stubs, things like that. So there's a list that you can refer back to. Now the ID and driver's license, something to keep in mind is the identification documents required for both the ID and driver's license are the same. DPS has put together fact sheets for both the homeless youth for their for an ID card or a license, and then we have put together our own document as well. And both of those are very helpful to look at when you're preparing for a visit to DPS office. The DPS also has a brochure called the what it takes to apply, and it has material, the list of documents arranged in a helpful way. It's a good resource. So if they have that certification homeless status form, then they do not need the documents that follow to the proof of residency in Texas required, and they will not have to pay the $16 fee. So if they have the birth certificate from Texas or another state, then they have proof of the US citizenship, which is the first requirement. And then the other big hurdle we see people have is proof of their Social Security number. So they either need their Social Security card or a W-2 form or 1099 form or a paycheck stub. And sometimes most paycheck stubs do not list your Social Security number these days. Most documents in general don't. But we've had some luck with asking an employer to provide a special paycheck stub with their name and Social Security number on it that they can use when they go to the DPS office. If they have any sort of letter from the Social Security Administration, or if they've gotten something called a Social Security Numiden history, and that's something that we can help a youth with if they're stuck and can't get any of these other things. But if that youth is at any sort of job, tell them be sure to hang on to those W-2 forms that they get in January, so they have that documentation of their Social Security number. And then they have to have some proof of their identity. Again, they're not likely to have the things, the primary identification documents. That's why they're at DPS, but they will have some of these other things. And so you just need to carefully go over the list with the youth. And I always encourage people, take 3 of these, it says to take 3 because they may reject one of them. And after you've managed to finally get an appointment and gone and waited for hours at DPS, the last thing you want to do is be rejected because they don't accept your school record, that it's not they say it's not an original or something like that. So supporting identification documents, be sure to get 3 of these. And again, if the youth is in school, hopefully that they should have the school record or transcript that they can use for this. Okay, finally, the certification form will help the youth with the driver's license. Again, the same way it would with an ID. They don't have to pay the fee for the actual license, which will be $16 or $32. And they don't have to have the proof of their residency. But there are many, many other requirements to get a driver's license. There are special requirements when you're under 18. And then there are special requirements when you're between the ages of 18 and 25. It's very complicated. We could spend an hour or more just talking about all those. So if you have a youth or a young adult you're helping with this, you need to go over all those things with them and make sure they're taking care of it. One of the biggest hurdles we know that homeless youth have had, especially homeless young adults, is in getting their driver's license, is they do not have a car with that has insurance and registration and everything that they can go take that driver's license test in, which is required. And something to keep in mind is that if they go through a driving school, they can, the driving school can offer the license and the test and provide the car with insurance for the test. And driving schools are, it's my understanding, are pretty flexible. So you can go there as an adult and say, I just need to do the 6-hour online course that I'm required to have, and I need a couple hours of practice driving, and then I'm ready to take the test. And they will, for a fee, but not an astronomical fee, offer that service. So if you have a youth who feels that they kind of know how to drive and they don't think they really need to go to driving school, that still they should consider exploring that if they're faced with the burden of they don't have in the car with the insurance to take the test. And if you have problems at the DPS office, I would show them that DPS fact sheet, that these are DPS created forms that should be in their procedures. Show the information on the certification form, ask for a supervisor, and as a last resort, obtain the name of the person denying, the reason for the denial, and contact our project. And again, there's our project's contact information and my information. As I said, it's best to call our main number and our project email address, because there are several other attorneys on my staff who can help answer questions if I'm not readily available to answer them. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Brett for the questions and answers.
Okay, thanks so much, Mary Christine. I know it's a complicated process and you're definitely the one who knows the ins and outs of it. We had a couple questions on the chat so far. One is usually DPS requires 2 forms of proof of residency. So youth that are homeless, the question is, so youth that are homeless, are they not required to provide both forms that are typically required, or would they still need to provide at least one proof of residency?
No, with the certification form, they don't have to provide proof of residency. Now they will need an address that they can mail that they fill out for their mailing address. And so the youth will need to figure out, like, if they are doubled up somewhere or couch surfing, if they feel that's a good address, they could potentially use the school or shelter address, but they do need to provide an address, because they will not give them the plastic copy of their license or ID that day. They'll just get a paper copy, and they'll need that address, and they'll need to be able to go to that address and pick up the item.
And then there were some questions about the materials being available, because I think your PowerPoint is helpful for people, and those will be available. We'll email them out. We'll post them along with this webinar to our Facebook, YouTube. And if you still can't find them, feel free to email me or Mary Christine. I was also, what was I going to add? I was going to add something else. Oh, yes. So these forms that DPS developed are really hard to find on the DPS website. So they're actually, I'm not even sure they're on there. So if you need those forms, I suggest you go to the Texas Foster Youth Justice Project's website, and they are there. And that is actually, there's kind of like every form you would need to kind of walk you through this process if you, get stuck or, haven't done it that much and are still familiarizing yourself. So I'd highly recommend that you use that as a resource. And Texas Appleseed will be putting up this webinar as well as other things to complement it, but that's really the one place to go right now. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that, Mary Christine mentioned that we have this fund, and the fund provides money so that these waivers are there. We definitely, took a while to get set up, but it's being used. However, I think there are probably so many homeless and foster care youth who are eligible and don't know about it, aren't using it. So we're hoping that this can kind of kick off some more awareness. And Texas Appleseed is going to be mailing posters to every high school in Texas to try and help kind of boost awareness. So if you get one of those, or maybe you should be on the lookout for one, they should be going out in January. So unless there are other questions, Mary Christine, anything else that you want to add?
I was just going to say that I know we sort of race through what the requirements are, and partly is because it's really boring, and partly because it's just complicated. And what I do, even though I've been doing this, for a decade, is I still, every time I have a youth, I pull out the lists and look at and find out what they have and go through and figure out what they have and what they need. And that's really the way you have to do it. So I certainly hope you access some materials. That was our intent, that you would find these helpful. And we try to provide links to the various websites that the agencies have as well, so you can get more information. And I wish there was like a really simple way to tell you what it was needed, and but there's not a magic formula. And the newer attorneys that work on our project have gone through this many times with me, and I think they can sympathize with you that it's just it's just a very cumbersome project. And unfortunately, due to identity theft and other issues that have come up, is that in the last couple decades, they have made it very difficult to get identification documents. And so there's just always more and more requirements. And I feel sorry for the people at DPS, because I feel like they spend most of their day telling people, no, that won't work, no, that won't work. And so so I hope that if you have any suggestions about the way we could rephrase things or redesign the materials. I know my paralegal has wanted to make something that's more use-friendly than our 4-page document. And if you have any suggestions about that, we'd love to hear about it. So thank you.
So the question is, what's the website for the youth forums again? So it's texasfosteryouthjustice.org.
No, texasfosteryouth.org.
Sorry, texasfosteryouth.org. And you're going to click through. Do you want to explain what you click through?
Yeah. Yes, just a second.
We go to For Youth, right, Mary Christine?
Yep. And then
okay. And then you'll see all these splotches, identification documents, and CPS records is right here. So you're going to click there. And right on this right side, of course, there's a lot of stuff here, but the homeless and unaccompanied youth getting their Texas birth certificate, ID, and license. You'll see these are the DPS fact sheets that we mentioned. Oh wait, it didn't. I downloaded it. I don't know. Can you all should be able to see that? So this is what we were talking about. That kind of has everything you would need in one spot. And then
all the homeless youth are in this one section together. So to make it easy for homeless, versus the foster youth, which is.
And it looks like the foster youth is below.
Yes.
Okay. So right here where I'm highlighting. So we can go ahead and send out that link as well, like to this direct page. So we'll send out a bunch of links to y'all, and we'll make sure and put this so you can go directly to here. But if you forget, it's just texasfosteryouth.org. Click through with the click through to the identification documents, and it's right there. So Mary Christine, have you successfully helped any youth get either birth certificates or social security cards while the offices have been closed because of COVID? That's a big hurdle our agency has had this year.
say I know somebody who applied through the mail for a birth certificate and was able to get it. The Social Security card, it is a huge barrier right now, because if you go to the Social Security webpage, it tells you you can get your birth certificate, apply online, but it turns out you have to actually be an adult, and not your birth certificate, your Social Security, you have to be an adult. And then the other barrier is, let's say you are working with somebody who is an adult, they actually have to have they have a way to verify your identity, and it kind of is like running your credit history. And so people who are young, people who have had identity, lacked identity documents, tend to not have any of that history. So I have not yet been successful, other than with the youth in foster care. They were able to get it for the youth by the eligibility specialist who was going to meet with Social Security people. So yes, I have had people get around the requirement at DPS to have a Social Security card by using their NUMIDENT history. And if somebody wants to find out more about that, they can just email us, and we can help them learn how to do that process.
Okay, great. I think that there's a question about how old do you have to, what's the minimum age when you can start doing this? And I know that rule might be there's some requirements for foster youth. So I just wanted to, if you could talk about at what age can you qualify for this?
So I think for a birth certificate, if there's somebody that fits under the statute that can certify them, that so the McKinney Vento Liaison, or the homeless shelter or transition center, or and I know that some of the Head Start and other programs use that definition as well. So if a child's involved in one of those programs, I think they should be able to be certified by wherever they're receiving services, and that so they or their caregiver could access the birth certificate for them. For ID, again, it's there as far as I know, there is no minimum requirement for as far as age goes for an ID. So generally it's, we see teens, when teens need it. But the DPS, in the law don't have any limits. So if somebody younger than that could potentially do it. But I think that a youth getting their ID when they're 14 or 15 is great.
And yeah, there are some requirements about DFPS is supposed to get certain documents for young people before they turn 16.
Yes.
So those are also on the Texas Foster Youth Justice Project website. So you can see those as well.
Yes, DFPS is supposed to get them all their documents before they turn 16. And it doesn't happen a lot. And that's why we see so many problems when it doesn't happen.
Yes. Okay, well, I think that wraps up our questions. Thanks so much for everyone for joining. And Mary Christine, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge. And like I said, we're gonna try and continue to boost awareness of this law and the laws just around getting IDs and driver's licenses. And I will say that, one of the reasons this is possible is because of all the people in the state of Texas who care about homeless youth and foster care youth, who took, a little bit of time and donated $1 or $2 when they renewed their driver's license. And so really grateful to them and to all of you for the work you do to help these young people. So thank you so much, and hope everyone has a good week. And yes, we'll be in touch via email.